us, Urban Programs Manager Carrie Skeena. If you would care to join us, we would really appreciate it. Okay, first on our agenda is public comment, and I don't see anyone, so we'll go right to communications. All right. You want to? Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
We have a communication, actually two communications. The first one is from Carrie Skeena, the Urban Programs Manager, regarding amending the Citizen Participation Plan.
Okay, motion is to, oh, no, we're going to discuss that first. Carrie, would you be so kind as to give us an overview of the memo that you sent out?
Sure. The Citizen Participation Plan is a document that's required as a recipient of our HUD grants, and it's basically the framework for the plan of how we obtain community input when we're conducting our planning and outreach efforts. And the last time the plan was updated was in 2010, alongside the consolidated plan at that time. It's remained in place and been working okay for us. HUD recently revised the regulations regarding citizen participation, and it now includes components for obtaining community input when conducting an assessment of fair housing. So that necessitated us to update our citizen participation plan so that we could then in turn start working on our assessment for fair housing. The assessment for fair housing is another revised regulation. It's taking the place of what used to be called the analysis of impediments to fair housing. So as HUD recipients, one of our primary objective is to further fair housing and deal with housing opportunities and looking at issues of segregation or access to fair housing and potential discrimination, and doing what we can with our HUD programs to alleviate those situations. So what used to be the analysis of impediments to fair housing is now called an assessment to fair housing. And the two topics are very closely related. And the reason they came up with the new way of doing fair housing assessment was to formalize what they had always expected grantees to do for public participation. They did have guidelines when you were conducting the old analysis, but by incorporating it into the regulations and saying communities must, do these types of things, it formalized that and kind of puts everybody on the same playing field across the country. And then they also rolled out a new online tool that they want grantees to be using when they conduct the assessment. And it's a mapping and data tool that populates certain standardized information into these plans. And it seems to me that HUD is trying to standardize things across the board and create templates so that it's easier for the public to understand and access these documents across the board, no matter what community you're in. So what we have out right now is the draft revisions to our former participation plan. And originally we're going to allow a 15-day comment period. We extended that because the prior Human Affairs Committee meeting was canceled due to snow. So we extended that out until I think at least tomorrow, because we wanted to be able to include any comments that might have been made at tonight's meeting into that plan. And again, it's eventually it will need to be formally adopted, so it will come through the board in a formal process, but I just wanted to at least have a dialogue on the document before then, and again, allow the public an opportunity to come in and speak to it before it's in its final iteration. So some of the big changes that were made to the existing plan, content-wise, was really just adding in all the references to the assessment of fair housing, and then laying out what we would consider our framework for conducting that. And again, it really didn't change the way we had done the prior plan. It just is putting it in writing. So what generally what we're looking to do, in addition to the prescribed tool that we have to use, we would be seeking the public input through various methods such as online surveys. We currently have one, so we've started some of that effort already. And we have a resident survey that's been online for several months. And we have promoted that through the Nashua Telegraph, social media. We have signage up on all the public transit buses, and people can scan the code and go right to the survey. And to date, we've only received about 52 responses on that, and that survey is really geared to assess the experience in obtaining housing as a resident. So it asks things such as along the lines of discrimination, you know, if they or their member of their household has ever been discriminated, and it goes into a whole host of reasons or topics on that. And then there's also another survey that was developed more for the use of service providers to get their perspective and you know, share with us some of the experiences that their clients may have faced in obtaining housing. And that has about 11 responses. So we need to beef those numbers up to have it be really worthwhile in the analysis. So we did hold one public hearing to obtain community input. That was not well attended. I suspect the weather the night that we had it was prior to snow. It was before the winter, but nonetheless it was a lousy night. So we attended a continuum of care session about a month or two ago, and then we've had a couple of focus groups. I should mention that we hired the Nashua Regional Planning Commission to assist us in doing this. They're very adept at conducting analysis and creating maps and GIS and all of that, so we're utilizing their expertise. And they've also just recently completed a similar plan for the region, so it's helpful to have them deal with that tool, especially where that's just been rolled out. And so they've facilitated a couple of focus groups, and some of the populations we targeted with that were disabled individuals, and we partnered with, we reached out to a few of the agencies in town who serve those clients and hosted it at one of their agencies to be able to communicate directly with some of the clients that they deal with. And the other focus group, we worked with Adult Learning Center and reached out to some of the immigrants and new Americans that are in that program to just get that firsthand experience of what they may be facing. And so the public input piece is ongoing. We hope to have a draft published in late May, early June. And like most of our HUD documents, there'll be a period of comments. So that will be about a 30-day comment period. And I would envision that at some point during that 30 days, it would come through this committee again to really, you know, get into the document itself and, you know, see if we get any additional public input on what the content reveals once the analysis is done. And again, the whole intent of that is once we've done all this analysis and we have these results, you know, take a look at, are there challenges to accessing fair housing? Are those challenges related to simply income and poverty, or is it also related to possibly race and discrimination issues? And then if there are any areas that we can incorporate some of those objectives into what we're doing with our HUD money, that's really what HUD wants to see us doing. So we're doing the plan now, a year or two in advance of our next consolidated plan, so that we have that information readily available to us as we develop another 5-year plan, which I know sounds crazy, but we're about to start year 3, so we're not that far off. And certainly some of the outcomes could be rolled into even our current action plans as we move forward, depending on what that reveals. So as far as the citizen participation plan goes, we really didn't change much of the original other than, kind of moving the structure around to match the HUD regs so it flows in the order that they wanted to see it. And, some grammatical changes, things like that. And then for obtaining community input, we tried to update to recognize more the trends of using electronics and social media than was the case in 2010, and move a little bit away from having to where, unless HUD tells us we have to do it, trying to move away from doing formal advertisements in the newspaper and print paper. They're obviously very expensive to do that and not always very effective at reaching who we need to. So an example would be, when we have a plan where we post that we have a plan and we're accepting comments. So we typically do that at the library. We post it here at City Hall as far as a hard copy notice, and then put it on our website, put it on our Facebook, put it on our Twitter, share it with the mayor's page, Nashua Transit, and pretty much anywhere we can think of getting that word out. We try to do email blasts. We have pretty good comprehensive lists of all the service agencies in town. So we try to share it with them so that they themselves can comment, or they can reach out to their clients and see if that population that we're trying to serve would also have comments. So sorry to ramble a little bit there, but
No, that's fine. It's fine. You're doing some good work out there.
yeah, so happy to answer any questions on either the citizen participation plan or the assessment of fair housing.
Any questions? Alderman LeBrun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How extensive is the wait list for housing?
It's very extensive. Internally, we don't necessarily maintain one because we don't have property that we oversee, but we do get that information from the Housing Authority and from service providers each year as we're developing our HUD plans. And depending on the type of household you are, it's going to vary how long the list is. But for example, senior housing is anywhere from 1 to 2 years to obtain a unit, and family housing, I think, is around there, maybe a little bit longer. But it's definitely, there's no list that's less than a year long to obtain subsidized housing.
Thank you.
I did just get a notice from the Housing Authority that they do have some availability for two-bedroom seniors. For a two-bedroom unit for seniors is not much of a waiting list there. The single-bedroom units, there is quite an extensive list. I'm talking years to wait. Also available through the Housing Authority are four-bedroom units, because they have no one really on their four-bedroom waiting list. So just getting that word out there, that if people do need those particular units, that the Housing Authority does have those available at this time. Carrie?
And on those two-bedroom units, because I asked a little bit further about that because I was intrigued that they really didn't have a demand for it. But my understanding is to qualify for that, the household, it has to the head of household at least has to meet the senior or elderly criteria. And then it may be a case where, a rare case, but say they have guardianship of a younger household member or something like that requires them to need a second bedroom. And in some cases, if they need some type of medical care, that would require. So my initial thought was, well, wow, why aren't people jumping on, having a two-bedroom? It's more space, and wouldn't that be great? But that's not how the rules work. So
Right.
the composition of the household has to require that they need two bedrooms. And I think it's limited, which is why they have the availability. Right. And then the 4 bedrooms is the same situation. There just aren't households that are that large.
Thanks for clarifying that. Anyone have any other questions on the citizen participation plan? Seeing none, could we get did you make a motion to accept that?
No.
Oh, could I get a motion?
I will.
Okay. Motion is
To accept and place on file.
to accept and place on file. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. We have another communication.
Yes, the second communication, also from Carrie Skana, Urban Program Development Manager, and it is regarding the development of the fiscal year 2018 Annual Action Plan, and I will make a motion to accept that and place it on file.
Okay, well, let's have a little discussion on this. This was interesting. Thank you for this
Yes.
extensive memo. If you wouldn't mind going through what was interesting to me was some of the things that didn't qualify that, you might want to clarify, because I know they're good organizations,
Right.
that applied. However, if you don't meet the criteria, go ahead.
Right. So this year we did our annual round of accepting proposals for the CDBG funding, which sometimes by this time we've received our allocation. So just to give a little background on that, HUD has advised that there probably will be a delay in announcing allocations this year, and that's due to passing the federal budget for fiscal year 17. So my understanding is that because it's still been in continuing resolutions, there'll be a delay by the time they either enact language in the continuing resolution or actually pass a budget. There's still a process that has to take place after that where they calculate all the numbers and goes through HUD headquarters. So it takes a while to filter down to the local level. So what they're advising is to move ahead with your process following your typical timeline and use an estimated number. And then as you develop the plan, they gave a few different options, but I think the one that made the most sense for your consideration would be that to have some type of a contingency plan so that you don't have to go back out and do the whole public process again. You could just say, if we get this much more, we'll fund this activity, or if we get less, we may not fund that activity. Or you could say just prorate the amount, everybody gets that little bit more or less to factor in the difference so that, again, you know what the plan is going to be when the actual number comes in, and then you can just submit the plan to HUD based on that. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. What I'm just suggesting is that we use level funding basically from last year. There's really no good indication of what that number is going to be because Congress really hasn't taken it up yet to know where that will go. So looking through the proposals this year, there were a few flags, if you will, that jumped out at us that I tried to outline in the memo just so we had the information ahead of time. The first one on the list is Child and Family Services, and at the time I wrote the memo, their proposal indicated that they had already selected a contractor, which kind of flagged to me that they may be a little further into the process than what might work with the federal requirements. So just last week, actually, we reached out and made sure that everybody also had a copy of the memo in case they had not seen it on the agenda. We sent it directly to all the applicants. Child and Family Services did respond and said they not only had they selected the contractor, the work was already underway. So unfortunately, the way the environmental regulations work with with these funds is that you can't have done something that what they call choice limiting, and that would either be entering into a legal agreement to do work or starting the work. Because in effect, that really doesn't give us any choice of how we would fund or what we would do with that activity. So they've indicated that they will just withdraw their application because it has already started. We do try ahead of time and in the application to make all of these rules clear, but there's a lot of rules. So
There are a lot of rules.
and it's understandable that they get missed. I'd like to say that thinking about the process in general, especially after this year's experience as we step through these, we thought that next year it might be prudent to do almost like a pre-application requirement prior to the deadline where it's just kind of a one-pager. What are you intending to do? Just give us a quick summary so that we have the chance to really view that ahead of time and help them assess whether or not it would or would not be eligible, so they don't have to go through the whole process of filling in an application if it's not going to be eligible. We do offer those technical assistance workshops, but they're voluntary, and if people come, they do, if not. So that was just one thought we had about the process for next year. So moving on to the second one, the Nashua Center. This was kind of it was difficult. All of these decisions were difficult to step through, and not to say that they're a done deal, because the agency may come in and clarify, or maybe they didn't make it as clear in their application as what we're interpreting. But Nashua Center appears that the work that they need done would all fall in the category of maintenance, which is not an eligible cost under under public facility improvements. And that's the category under which this committee reviews them. And the intent there on HUD's perspective is that the CDBG grant can only allocate up to 15% of its annual grant to support operating costs of nonprofits. And they want to ensure that, you're not circumventing that 15% by saying it's a renovation when it's really not, and it's maintenance. And there's definitely some projects that, you kind of like, oh, I don't know, it's right on the line. I'm not really sure how they would view that. But you have to look at the whole big picture and try to go from there. But they do have some pretty clear guidance on how to categorize if something is maintenance or not. And most of the, if not all the items that they mentioned, really we felt did fall into the maintenance category and should be something covered by an operating budget, not as a true renovation. They're not integral parts of systems or permanent fixtures. It talked about replacing worn doors, painting some rooms, doing some carpet tiles, some ceiling tiles, things like that. So that we really just felt that was maintenance. So that's something to consider. Nashua Children's Home, their proposal is for painting the exterior of a couple of their buildings, like located on Concord Street. And at first glance, we thought, oh no, here's another one. It's painting, it's maintenance. But when you reading the guidance, there is a section about exterior painting. And, it talks about if you're out there kind of doing spot painting and patching, that may be considered maintenance. If you're going into a full-scale paint job where you're doing the entire structure, or you're using high-pressure washing, something of that scope, then you should be considering that rehab. So based on the quotes that they had attached in the description of work, it seemed like it did sway over into the full-scale, more of a rehab type project. I also kind of called to the attention of the committee that those are in the historic district, so any work that is done there would have to be done consistent with the federal guidelines for working on historic properties. So high pressure washing may not be allowed, which would mean there would be even more probably hand scraping and obviously lead paint and things of those natures we would have to take into consideration. So given the scope of that, we still felt comfortable calling that a public facility improvement versus maintenance. The next one was the Police Athletic League, or PAL, and they had some work on the exterior that they need to do to the steps and the columns and the brickwork, and that was fine. But then they also added in a small piece of maintaining part of their sprinkler system, and again, that kind of fell into the maintenance category. That would not be eligible as a facility improvement. I mean, if you were rehauling and redoing the entire sprinkler system, that would be one thing, but it talked about minor things, and it was a small amount of money. It was just under $3,000, I think. So again, that was indicative of the fact that it was really just maintaining the system. And then the last one here was Salvation Army. They are looking to renovate 2 of their bathrooms to make them handicap accessible and meet current ADA requirements. And they indicate in their application that they're a not-for-profit entity, but there is a question based on our knowledge of the agency, and then when you go to their website, what their mission statements read and things of that sort, that would indicate that they're a faith-based organization. That doesn't make it ineligible, but there is some care that has to be taken that there is a separation, that between church and state separation. And we've done some other faith-based entities in the past, and what we do is, depending on how the facility is used, sometimes it's very clear that there's a section of the building that is for the church and a section that is for a community purpose, and you can kind of prorate based on square footage. I don't get the sense, and I haven't been to the facility, so it's something I think that we need to consider moving forward as we figure out what that ratio is going to be. But I get the sense that it's one big building used for multiple purposes, sometimes for religious purposes and sometimes for community. So in that case, we might have to look at a percentage of time usage and figure out what the ratio would be that way.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, it is going to be a little tricky, and I think we're going to have to reach out to the Salvation Army and see. I mean, they may already have some type of a plan if they've obtained other funding that required them to already step through this process, which would be ideal. But if not, we just have to have that conversation with them and find out what makes the most sense to determine if it's going to be eligible or not.
Alderman Karen?
Yes, thank you. They do have two buildings. That's why I was wondering, were they talking the building that's on Montgomery Ave or the one on Dickerman Street? I don't remember in my head. I should have looked before I asked.
That's okay. I think, and I'm trying
Okay.
to remember, we did go back and we did reach out to them a little bit, via email, trying to clarify a little bit beforehand. And I think they said it was the bathrooms in their main facility.
Okay, so, because there is the back building is basically used for their children's programs and activities. I don't know if they use it for religious, but the main building that faces Main Street onto Montgomery Ave is their, really what I would consider their church. And
So that would make it easier.
so that might make it a little bit easier.
Right.
Yeah, but you're right, we should be asking them that question.
All right. So, I mean, those were really like I said, the flags that we saw when we went through the applications, to call to the committee's attention. And obviously, I don't expect it to be this is what we say, end of it. I assume there'll be some discussion, not just among the committee, but also with the agencies and the applicants to help clarify some of these points and to a point where everybody's comfortable with the information. And then regarding the memo, I think I already talked about the next paragraph where I was talking about the HUD funding. And then the last paragraph referenced the home funding. Typically, when I forward the communication at this time of year, we kind of give an example of what the home numbers might look like as well. I feel like it's the theme of the night, but again, HUD implemented some new regulations. I guess they don't want us to get bored. I think, keep us on our toes.
Keep you on your toes, absolutely.
So and actually it was a couple of years ago across the board for HUD programs. There was the Office of Inspector General had done an audit of HUD programs and determined what HUD had been doing was basically kind of using a first in, first out method for their accounting, and the OIG said that doesn't really follow your regulations and moved over to what they're calling a grant-based accounting system. And you're now tying specifically when you fund something to a grant year, which, ultimately moving forward will actually help with tracking and make things a lot more clear, rather than it just drawing from this big pool of funds and you're never really sure which grant year in the system is funding something. But it will have a big impact, and it is having a big impact to the home program. The home program has these rules about committing things in a timely manner. So you have to commit the funds within 24 months of receiving them, and then from that time, then it all has to be expended within 5 years after you commit it. And that's where OIG said, well, how do you know if you're just using this cumulative method that grantees are truly spending that money within 24 months from any given grant? So where this year is kind of the transition year where when it switched over to grant-based accounting, we know which fiscal year that happened. It's very clear. We know what our deadlines are for those dates. And then they added in some additional language that just went in place in January to say, okay, all of that old money also has to be committed by this year's deadline. Because I guess to a degree that they're just they want to clean it up, I think, get the books cleaned up, get everybody on track to be doing the grant-based accounting. So it's not a radical change really, because we always know we need to get that older money committed. And so we're looking to, we have some funds on the home side of things where at the end of July they need to be committed to activities. And when I wrote this memo, we were still trying to suss out some of that and figure out where we were with numbers and run some new HUD reports, because again, as they're transitioning, obviously the tracking and the reporting is all transitioning. So we do have the short story is, and we'll step through this, I think, probably at the next meeting in a little more detail. I'll do another memo that lays everything out. But we have a little over 100,000 that we know absolutely has to be committed by the end of July. There's that other, we have that contract, and I've talked about it a few times at this committee, that we entered into with NeighborWorks of Southern New Hampshire, who was going to operate a home buyer program for us. That contract was for $165,000, again, under the home program. And despite valiant efforts of trying to roll that program out, we just continue to face roadblocks with the underwriting requirements for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac conflicting with home requirements. And ultimately what it was coming down to was that those principal mortgage programs didn't want our subordinate lien on there. But we didn't really have a choice of how we can write our subordinate lien because of the way the home regs require. Right. So, I mean, those agencies, I think, need to work that out at some point. But in the meantime, we have funds that we're not really going to be able to do what we hoped.
So
with.
besides the 100,000, we must have other funds that are coming up. I mean, we have funds there now, but what is that amount, and how far out do we have to commit those?
We have, of the old money, that's the 102,000. The 165 that we had allocated to NeighborWorks, we know we need to do something with that as well by the end of July. And we are working with them. They have come in with some other proposals. They're not really ripe for funding or conversation yet. So there's a potential that amount of money may come before here to be recommitted or reprogrammed still to NeighborWorks, but for a slightly different purpose. But we are talking to a couple of other agencies who, because we take the home applications on a rolling basis, so, we generally will get calls from different developers or nonprofits who are looking as they're in their planning stages. So we do have a couple of potential entities. I feel confident that we're not going to lose the money, that we'll have a project ready in time. That, again, it would come through the committee the same way the home projects always do, and be ready to commit those funds by the end of July.
So that's those two pots of funds, the 102 and the 165 that have to be committed by July.
Right.
And then on top of that, there must still be funds. Okay.
Yep. On top of that, we have our current fiscal year money, which is, we're in fiscal year 17. So we have about another year before those have to be committed, because it's the 24 months. And then we've also, in a prior year when we were hoping that homebuyer program was going to be successful, had set aside $55,000 for a couple of years in a row to go toward those efforts. They weren't tied up into that contract, because we were just launching that contract, but we said, if that goes well, the desire was let's keep funding that as an ongoing program. So we have some of that money too. So again, I'll lay all the numbers out so that we have it at the next meeting to really work through. And it's only a couple of weeks away, so I don't think project-wise I'll have much more to talk about.
Right. I
But,
think Alderman LeBrun might have had a question
yeah.
for you. Did you have a question?
Madam Chair,
You're welcome.
what happens to the unexpended funds? Do they simply lapse, or is there a trigger mechanism that you can bring those back? How does that work?
So on the home program, if they're not committed by what our deadlines are, we lose them. They're recaptured by the Treasury, and it's statutory, so there's really nothing that even the HUD field office or anybody, you can't appeal for it back. Ultimately, it goes into the big pot, and Congress reallocates it the next time they do a funding cycle. And every home grantee across the country is in this position this year because it's your FY16 money and all of your pre-16 money that's coming to a head by your commitment deadline this year. So again, it's not like we haven't known this. We knew this change was coming, and we have been having those conversations ongoing. Everybody understands the importance of not losing the funds and making sure they're used to develop more affordable housing.
Okay. Okay, so any other discussion on this communication? We can talk a little bit more about this if you'd like, but I'd like to accept the communication if no one has any questions. The motion before us is to accept the communication from Carrie Skeena regarding development FY18 annual action plan. Further discussion on that? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And that motion carries. I guess as a committee, what I would like to do, as we do every year, is maybe set up some site visits. I didn't want to forget about that anywhere in here.
On my mind, too.
Yeah, I know that Alderman Melissa Goya typically Friday afternoons,
Yeah.
not so much.
Well, probably like 3:30, 3:15. No,
Okay.
that's late for agencies.
Yeah, it is, well, because there are so many, I don't know how we could
Yeah.
get to them that late in the, not sure.
How many do we have?
Looks like
Because we
1,
didn't go to
2,
all of them last year, right?
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9?
Between 7 and 9, because,
Yeah.
Child and Family Services.
Oh, yeah, right.
Take them out.
Right.
Front Door Agency is for a future acquisition, so that's nothing to see there. I mean, you can look through and decide.
Can I ask you about that one?
Mhm.
Would that qualify for the home funds?
It would, and that's actually one of the people that we're talking to find out, what if there was a preference for why it was CDBG versus home. And I think there was a perception that there wasn't going to be enough home funds to make it worthwhile. But when we had the conversation with the executive director there, she indicated that, if it's a substantial amount, that would really make it worthwhile and make the numbers work, then she absolutely would consider using home funds for that type of activity.
Now, what about the soup kitchen project?
That is not eligible for home because it's shelter. You have to have true units, self-contained units, to be eligible for home. And home also requires at least 1-year leases when you're qualifying entities. So, and it specifically says emergency and transition. Well, not transitional housing is allowed if there are self-contained units and come
Okay.
with a lease, but that emergency shelter is not in the classic sense eligible.
Okay. Thank you. So is there, maybe we could do it on 2 different dates if it's that late in the day that you're available. I'd be okay with that too. I don't know about anyone else, but. Like, do you want to just think about it and send an email and we can work it out that way? What times might be best for everybody? That way we don't have to figure it out right here. Okay, so we'll work on that. And there are quite a few to see, so.
When do you want to do them by?
I mean, typically we would have tried to do it before the next meeting, the way the schedule is kind of laid out, but given that that's only 2 weeks away now, I think that might be tough. Yeah, I mean, it might not, depending on people's availability, but if not by the next meeting, probably, you would definitely want to have it done by the April meeting, because I think if I just mentally thinking back to the schedule, by April, that's around the time when you kind of need to start coming up with a funding plan so that there's time to introduce it to the full board and have it come back for approval by May 15th. May 15th is usually our cutoff date.
And our next meeting's the 13th of March?
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless you want to change that.
I don't know that there are dates available. I'd have
Right.
to check. Budget coming up, and I know you have some requirements to meet, but there's no need. Is there a public hearing on that date? No, right?
There's not.
No. Okay. Well, we'll as it gets a little closer, we'll see if there is any legislation coming in. If not, maybe we can see if we can change it, but.
Change it to April.
Okay. Okay, moving on. I think, are we good with you, Carrie? Is that everything?
I guess the other thing that you typically do at this first discussion is
Oh,
the public service amount.
Okay. So, unfinished business, we have none. Under new business, I think maybe Alderman Karen might want to ask us something.
Always looking for money. I'd like to make a motion so that we could apply 15% of the funding to the community,
Citizens Advisory
community, Citizens Advisory grant funding. No, I have
Okay.
to write that down.
So your motion would be to allocate the full 15% of the Community Development Block Grant,
Right.
which I believe we're estimating at $611,000, Carrie?
Right.
So that amount would be $91,650.
$650? Right.
Oh, it's on there. Look at you. You're good. Further discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? And that motion carries. All right. I think that concludes our business.
Move to adjourn?
Motion is to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. It's 7:45. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
I love these short, sweet meetings.
Here you are, Carrie. Yeah, I like